Hey guys, tonight we slip into the shadows of a world you don't usually picture when you imagine medieval Europe. Not battlefields, not castles, but cloisters, those narrow, candle-lit passageways inside convents, where the air is thick with wax, smoke and whispered prayers. You picture your steps echoing softly on cold flagstones, your fingertips grazing the rough, lime-washed walls, the hush around you so absolute that even your own breathing feels impertinent. Outside, the town sleeps, but in here, a different kind of wakefulness lingers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somewhere, someone is hearing this at 3 a.m., clutching a cup of lukewarm tea, while another person, halfway across the world, is dozing off after lunch. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tread beneath the long, vaulted ceiling of a convent corridor. Flickering oil lamps hang from iron hooks, casting long stripes of light that refuse to sit still. Candles are set into shallow niches, their flames quivering whenever a draught sneaks through cracks in the stone. At first glance, it looks peaceful, a sanctuary carved away from the world's troubles. But you already suspect that serenity is only a mask. Behind the carved oak doors, locked at night with iron bolts, secrets coil tighter than rosary beads. You pause at one door, its hinges shrieking faintly as a gust pushes against it. Imagine being a novice nun, just 15 or 16, wide-eyed and trembling, lying awake on your straw mattress while footsteps scrape past. Was that the sound of a sister pacing restlessly, or something heavier, more forbidden? Convent walls had ears, but they also had lips, and the whispers carried better in silence than any shout in the marketplace. One mainstream historical fact to anchor you: medieval nunneries really were centres of discipline and prayer, with strict rules called the Rule of Saint Benedict, shaping daily life. Bells rang to summon the nuns to prayers 7 times a day. Every action had a rhythm, every silence a meaning. Yet those same structures created shadows, spaces where secrecy could fester. And here comes a quirky tidbit. Some nunneries actually had cats officially listed as members of their community, recorded in ledgers as mousers, with little allowances of food. Picture it: a convent cat prowling through candle-lit cloisters, tails swishing, the only creature that could walk freely between dormitories and chapels without suspicion. And yes, probably silently judging everyone. Cats, after all, have always been professional side-eye specialists. Historians still argue whether the common image of a perfectly obedient convent is even close to reality. Was it really silence and spotless piety, or was it an elaborate performance, like one of those Instagram versus reality comparisons? The truth likely sat somewhere in the middle. Daily devotion, yes, but also locked cupboards of fine wines sent by wealthy patrons, or letters smuggled in under baskets of bread. You picture yourself standing at the crossing of 2 cloisters. To your left, the chapel door glows faintly with candlelight. To your right, the refectory sits in hushed darkness, the scent of cabbage and smoke lingering in the rafters. Behind you, a staircase spirals upward into cells, each tiny room housing a soul torn between divine calling and human longing. And in front of you, another corridor, darker still, where your footsteps hesitate. One lamp sputters out, and the shadows suddenly thicken. You feel the weight of history pressing down, those centuries of whispered sins and stifled laughter. Because here's the trick: the darker the silence, the louder the secrets. And tonight, you're not just passing through, you're staying long enough to hear them. You move deeper into the cloister, and the walls themselves seem to hum with memory. Here's the thing most people forget. Not every nun arrived at these convent doors by choice. Some did, yes. Fervent young women eager to give themselves to God, or widows who sought solace after the loss of a husband. But far more often it wasn't devotion that led a girl into a veil. It was family politics, inheritance squabbles, or the cold arithmetic of having too many daughters. You picture yourself as the second or third-born girl in a noble household. Your elder sister is destined for marriage, perhaps with a hefty dowry attached. But you, well, your dowry chest is considerably lighter, so your parents bundle you into a wagon and send you off to the local abbey with some silver coins and a polite note saying, "Please keep her busy with prayer." It sounds cruel, but to them it was pragmatic. After all, medieval estates couldn't be carved up infinitely. Someone had to be sacrificed to the cloister. A solid historical fact, throughout Europe, especially from the 11th to the 15th centuries, nunneries functioned as convenient deposit boxes for noble daughters. In some cases, entire convents were filled almost exclusively with aristocratic women, their dowries collectively funding the abbey's survival. Now the quirky tidbit, there are records of girls as young as 7 being enrolled in convents, treated like boarders at what amounted to holy boarding schools. Picture that, little kids in oversized habits, struggling to sit still during hours of chanting, sneaking glances at one another when they thought the prioress wasn't looking. Medieval spirituality may have demanded solemnity, but childhood mischief didn't magically evaporate with baptismal water. Historians still argue whether these forced placements were as grim as they sound. Were these girls truly locked into lifelong vows, or did families sometimes view the convent as a temporary safe house until a better marriage arrangement could be struck? Evidence suggests both happened. Some novices slipped out into arranged marriages later, while others were pressed into final vows against their will. You imagine the emotions of a young novice walking into the cloister for the first time. The heavy wooden doors slam behind her, and suddenly the world she knew, her family's halls, the marketplace chatter, even the gossip of servants, vanishes. All that's left is the echo of bells and the scratch of her own sandals on the stone floor. No wonder some of them resisted. Chronicles mention novices who tried to escape, sometimes literally climbing walls or bribing guards. Spoiler: most weren't successful. There's a dark humour in it too. Imagine being a teenage girl in the 14th century, rolling your eyes at a stern abbess, muttering under your breath during prayers, and plotting with your best friend about sneaking into the garden at night. Swap out the habits for hoodies, and suddenly convent life looks a lot like a very strict all-girls school. Some things never change, like teenagers testing boundaries. But underneath the mischief, the stakes were real. Breaking vows wasn't just bad behavior, it could stain your entire family's reputation. Parents often used convent placements to display piety and reinforce social status. A daughter in the veil wasn't just a mouth fed at someone else's table, she was also a living billboard of the family's devotion. If she misbehaved, that billboard cracked. As you wander past the sleeping quarters, you can almost hear the uneven breathing of girls tucked into narrow beds. Some whisper prayers, some whisper complaints, and some, just like you might, lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this stone prison was ever meant to be their fate. And so, the locked gates of nunneries didn't only keep the outside world away. They also kept in the daughters that society deemed spare. And the silence of these cloisters. It wasn't just chosen, it was imposed. You keep walking, the cool air brushing against your cheeks, and the soundscape of the convent shifts. Bells toll in the distance, muffled by stone, then fade into a silence so thick it almost presses against your ears. That's the thing about these places. Silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a rule, a discipline, a way of life. The vow of silence, or at least the vow of careful speech, was central in many convents. Imagine it. Entire days when the only words allowed were prayers chanted together in rhythm. No gossip in the refectory, no whispered jokes in the dormitory, no idle chatter in the garden. Words had to be rationed, like flour or firewood, and the misuse of speech could lead to penance. A straightforward historical fact. Most convents followed adaptations of the rule of Saint Benedict, which laid out strict guidelines about silence. Talking was restricted to specific times and places. Meals were eaten in silence while a single sister read aloud from holy texts. Even gestures were codified. Convents had sign languages, systems of hand signals to ask for bread, water, or a writing tablet without breaking the hush. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some convent sign languages grew so elaborate that they included signals for onions, cheese, and even beer. You can picture a row of solemn nuns making complex hand gestures over their plates, like they were ordering at a medieval drive-through. It's proof that even in silence, human creativity finds loopholes. But silence wasn't always holy, it was also heavy. Imagine lying in your narrow bed listening to your own breath echo. Every cough from the next bed sounded like thunder, and every secret, every crush, every regret, every resentment got bottled up because there was no casual way to spill it. Silence turned nuns inward, magnifying thoughts until they filled the whole room. Historians still argue whether this vow of silence was spiritually liberating or psychologically suffocating. Was it meant to free the mind for divine contemplation, or did it slowly unravel people, driving them into daydreams, visions, or quiet rebellions? Perhaps it did both. Picture yourself slipping into the cloister at midnight. The corridor is lined with sleeping cells, each door shut tight. Not a word escapes, but you feel the pulse of unspoken thoughts. Maybe Sister Agnes wonders about the boy she last saw at 13, now long gone. Maybe Sister Beatrice worries about her family's estate back home. And maybe Sister Catherine, just 2 doors down, is praying with clenched fists, bargaining with God about whether she really belongs here. Silence had its cracks. There were always places where words slipped through: the laundry, the herb garden, the infirmary. In those spaces, whispers leaked, carrying jokes, confessions, or plans. Think about it. If you'd been told not to talk for days, wouldn't the smallest conversation feel like a revolution? One more detail. Silence wasn't evenly enforced. The abbess, of course, could talk when she needed. Confessors and priests visiting from outside had full voices. The novices, meanwhile, often bore the brunt of stricter rules, so the hierarchy of speech mirrored the hierarchy of power. You pause by a window, looking out into the convent's inner courtyard. Moonlight drapes the grass in silver. Somewhere, an owl hoots, reminding you that not all voices can be silenced. And you wonder, did the vow of silence purify? Or did it merely teach women to guard their words so tightly that when they finally burst out, they carried far more weight than anyone expected? And in that moment, as the convent lies cloaked in hush, you realize the silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the loudest secret of all. You shift from the cloister hall into the refectory, and suddenly the smell of food lingers in the air, even though the benches are empty and the trestle tables bare. Food, or the lack of it, shaped convent life just as much as prayer. Officially, nuns were meant to eat plain and modest meals: bread, vegetables, maybe fish on occasion. Meat from 4-legged animals was usually banned, partly for reasons of discipline, partly because the church thought flesh made the spirit unruly. But if you've ever tried living on watery pottage and hard crusts day after day, you know how fast holy can turn into hangry. A mainstream historical fact, fasting was central to medieval piety, and convents often observed long periods of abstinence, not just during Lent. Some orders limited meals to once a day at certain seasons. The idea was simple. By denying the body, the soul could soar higher, but your stomach might have disagreed. And then the quirky tidbit: records tell us that some nunneries secretly indulged in delicacies: wheels of cheese tucked into storerooms, barrels of ale gifted by patrons, even contraband hams slipped in under cloaks. There's a famous account of an abbess scolding her sisters for overindulging in roast goose, a reminder that, yes, even women in veils sometimes gave in to cravings. Picture a solemn convent feast turning into something that looked suspiciously like Thanksgiving dinner, with everyone politely pretending it was still an act of devotion. You settle onto one of the long benches, and your imagination fills the space with clatter. Wooden bowls sliding, spoons scraping, the distant hum of a single voice reading from scripture while everyone else eats in silence. You probably imagine nuns stoically chewing cabbage, but once in a while they tasted honey, almonds, or spiced wine. Human nature always finds the loophole. Historians still argue whether these indulgences were rare exceptions or quietly common. Were the convent kitchens truly austere, or did most abbesses turn a blind eye to the occasional wedge of brie or gulp of ale? Evidence from account books suggests that many convents accepted gifts of fine food as part of their income, so either way, luxury had a way of slipping past the gates. But food wasn't only about survival or indulgence, it was also a weapon. Punishments often came in the form of meagre rations. Break a rule, and your bread might be halved, your soup thinned to near water. Imagine sitting at the same table as everyone else, your stomach growling louder than the psalm being read aloud while the others spoon up heartier fare. Hunger, here, was discipline, sharpened into silence. There's humour tucked in too. Picture Sister Margaret hiding a hunk of cheese under her sleeve, or Sister Joan sneaking an onion from the garden and thinking herself the cleverest thief alive. It's a reminder that even cloistered life had small rebellions, the kind that make you grin across the centuries. You walk toward the kitchen, where the air is thick with soot and the faint tang of herbs. A blackened cauldron hangs over cold ashes. In the corner, shelves are lined with clay jars, some filled with lentils, others with dried peas, and maybe, if you're lucky, a hidden stash of imported spices. The scent of nutmeg and cinnamon would have been as intoxicating to a medieval nun as a box of chocolates is to you. And as you leave, you realize convent food wasn't only about feeding the body. It revealed who had power, who bent rules, and who hungered in more ways than one. Bread and wine were sacred symbols, but they were also practical battlegrounds, where obedience and desire collided on every plate. You leave the kitchen and step into a long corridor where the toll of a bell rolls through the stone like thunder wrapped in velvet. In medieval nunneries, bells were the heartbeat of existence. They weren't just background noise, they carved the day into slices so thin that nothing escaped their rhythm. Sleep, prayer, work, study, eating, all of it stitched together by the sound of iron swinging against bronze. A historical fact to anchor this, the rule of St. Benedict, which shaped many convent schedules, demanded that prayers be said at fixed hours of the day and night. Matins before dawn, lauds as the sun rose, prime in early morning, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at dusk, and compline before bed. That's 8 times daily, enough to make your Fitbit explode if it tracked kneeling instead of steps. The quirky tidbit: some convents apparently had alarm nuns. Their actual job was to rouse everyone else at odd hours, ensuring that sleepy sisters didn't skip prayers. Imagine being shaken awake at 2 in the morning by Sister Agnes, who looks like she hasn't blinked since Christmas, hissing, "Up, it's matins." You'd probably grumble, "Just 5 more minutes." But in here, 5 minutes late was a sin tallied against eternity. Historians still argue whether this constant interruption brought spiritual clarity or just chronic sleep deprivation. Did night prayers open a window into mystical experiences, or were they simply the medieval equivalent of forcing people into zombie mode? Some argue that visions reported by nuns, angels, demons, or Christ himself may have been half-dreams induced by exhaustion. You picture yourself trying to keep up. The bell rings before dawn and you stumble from your straw mattress into the chapel. Cold stone presses against your bare feet. The air is sharp, breath visible in winter, candles guttering in draughts. You shuffle into the wooden stall, your voice joining the chant. The Latin words rise and fall, half sung, half murmured, washing over you like a tide. For a few moments, the rhythm does feel hypnotic, but then your stomach growls or your knees ache and you remember you're human, not an angel. Every hour had its duty. After prayers came work, scrubbing floors, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, or caring for the sick. Then another bell, and another prayer. The cycle was relentless, a kind of holy hamster wheel. Some found peace in that repetition, while others surely longed to break free. if only for one unmeasured afternoon. The refectory echoed again at noon, with everyone eating in silence while one sister read scripture aloud. You imagine chewing your bread slowly, listening to a passage about divine love, and wondering quietly whether Sister Margaret's sleeve still hides that wedge of cheese. By mid-afternoon, you're back in chapel, the chant rising again. By nightfall, you're exhausted, but the bell won't let you rest for long. Midnight prayers wait just beyond the thin veil of sleep. There's humour even in this discipline. Think of the nuns who dozed off mid-chant, their heads jerking back like modern commuters on a bus, or the ones who mumbled the Latin phonetically, not fully awake, like medieval karaoke without a screen. You'd probably have done the same. As you wander through the quiet cloister now, the echoes of bells long gone still seem to linger in the air. You realize the sound wasn't just a signal, it was a leash, tethering every sister to the same unbroken rhythm, and beneath that rhythm, secrets still pulsed, hidden in the silences between bells, waiting for the right hour to break free. The bells fall silent for now, and you drift toward the small, dimly lit chamber set aside for confession. The wooden screen divides two worlds. On one side, the anxious whispers of a nun, on the other, the voice of a priest, sometimes comforting, sometimes cold, and sometimes, if we're being honest, manipulative. Confession was meant to cleanse the soul, but it also created power. One mainstream historical fact: from the 13th century onward, annual confession was mandated by the church, and convents became regular stops for confessors appointed by bishops or abbots. These priests held immense sway. They didn't just forgive sins, they could shape reputations, dictate penances, and report problematic nuns to higher authorities. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some records, confessors complained that nuns confessed to too many little sins, things like nodding off during prayers or smuggling onions from the garden. Imagine a priest scribbling notes thinking, "Sister Anne, third onion infraction this month." It's oddly bureaucratic, like a medieval HR file nobody asked for. But beneath those small sins lurked larger ones. Historians still argue whether priests always kept their vows of chastity when dealing with nuns. Some sources accuse confessors of exploiting their authority, turning spiritual intimacy into something far murkier. Others insist such tales were exaggerated by critics of the church. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, hidden in whispers that never made it into official records. You picture yourself kneeling behind the wooden grill, the rough lattice pressing against your forehead as you whisper your failings. The priest leans close, listening. His responses are measured, but his tone reveals more than just piety. Does he sound merciful, stern, or faintly curious in a way that unsettles you? The line between spiritual father and human man blurs in this tiny, candle-lit space. Punishments from confession weren't always dramatic. Sometimes it was a handful of extra prayers or a day of fasting or scrubbing floors until your knees bled. Other times, though, the penance bordered on humiliating. There are accounts of nuns forced to kneel barefoot in the chapel for hours, holding a candle heavier than their own arms. Imagine your muscles shaking while the entire community files past, eyes averted but ears buzzing with judgment. Confession was also a tool of control beyond the convent. Bishops used priests' reports to monitor abbesses, ensuring they weren't too independent. Remember, abbesses controlled land, money, and sometimes even local politics. A whispered accusation in confession could justify intervention or removal. There's an eerie irony here. In theory, confession was the one place where you could be completely honest, unburdened of secrets. But in practice, it might have been the most dangerous room of all. Your words, once spoken, could never be unsaid, and if the wrong ears heard them, they could haunt you for years. You pause by the confessional, imagining the flicker of a candle catching on the lattice. The room feels small yet heavy, with centuries of unspoken truths. Maybe Sister Agnes confessed to a stolen glance at a passing monk. Maybe Sister Margaret confessed to hoarding that cheese. And maybe, just maybe, another confessed to something so grave, so human, that it shook the entire cloister. And as you step back into the corridor, the silence outside feels different now. It isn't peaceful, it's loaded, stretched tight with secrets that once poured through a wooden screen where forgiveness and power were braided so tightly together you could hardly tell them apart. The confessional fades behind you and you step into a vaulted storeroom. At first glance it looks unremarkable. Shelves stacked with baskets of grain, jars of beans, clay pots sealed with wax. But if you look closer, if you tug open the lids and lift the dusty cloths, you find treasures that don't quite match the story of poverty and simplicity told at the altar. One straightforward historical fact: medieval nunneries, especially the wealthier ones, held vast amounts of land, property deeds, and material wealth. Nobles funneled daughters into cloisters with generous dowries, and kings, queens, or bishops often donated land in exchange for perpetual prayers. Over decades, some convents became economic powerhouses, managing estates that rivaled those of minor lords. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some convent account rolls list strange donations, rings set with precious stones, bolts of expensive silk, even the occasional bejeweled reliquary that may or may not have contained the actual bone of a saint. You imagine a nun carefully cataloguing one sapphire ring, one embroidered cloak, one finger bone of Saint Who Knows. Whether genuine or not, these objects gave an aura of sanctity and serious bargaining power. Historians still argue whether convents' wealth was primarily spiritual insurance for donors or simply a convenient way for aristocrats to park money under holy protection. After all, a donation to a nunnery was less likely to be looted in wartime than a chest left in a manor house. But the result was the same: abbesses sitting on coffers of treasure while preaching detachment from worldly goods. You picture yourself slipping through the storeroom by candlelight, running a hand over a locked chest. Inside might be a collection of silver chalices, their surfaces dulled by time, but once gleaming on feast days. Or perhaps a pouch of coins, marked with the face of a king who promised salvation in exchange for prayers he wasn't entirely sure would work. There's humour here too. Imagine Sister Joan trying to explain to a novice why they had 6 jewel-encrusted chalices but still made everyone eat cabbage soup every Friday. The disconnect between treasure and daily austerity would have been glaring, and probably the subject of many whispered complaints during laundry duty. Wealth shaped power dynamics as much as prayer. Abbesses who controlled rich estates often clashed with bishops who wanted their cut. Some abbesses even loaned money to local lords, flipping the usual hierarchy upside down. Think about that. A cloistered woman in a veil quietly functioning as the town's banker. But wealth also bred suspicion. Were nuns truly holy, or just living comfortably behind walls? Chronicles sometimes accused rich convents of indulgence, silk sheets, feasts, even pet birds in gilded cages. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories stuck, feeding centuries of gossip about the secret luxuries of women supposedly dedicated to poverty. You pause in front of a cabinet carved with vines and roses. Its hinges creak as you open it, and inside glitters something unexpected, a necklace of gold, pearls strung like drops of frozen moonlight. You imagine it was once worn by a noble bride-to-be who never made it to the altar, her fate sealed instead by a forced veil. Her family's wealth stayed with her, hidden here, glowing in the dark like a trapped memory. And as you step back, the contradiction becomes clear. These cloisters were meant to renounce the world, yet behind their locked doors they mirrored it, land, money, jewels and all. You leave the storeroom, your fingertips still tingling from the imagined touch of pearls, and you step into a small chamber that smells faintly of wax, ink, and dried parchment. This is the scriptorium where quills scratch at night, and words, dangerous, sacred, or both, flow across vellum. Officially, nuns copied psalters and prayer books, but between the lines other things slipped through. One straightforward historical fact: many medieval convents were centres of literacy. Nuns were among the few women in Europe who could read and write Latin, which meant they were valuable as scribes. They produced manuscripts, illuminated texts, and letters for patrons. Their hands, cramped from long hours, carried not just holy scripture, but also the correspondence of the powerful. Here's the quirky tidbit. There are records of convents where nuns wrote not only prayers but also poetry, some playful, some romantic, and some that raised eyebrows centuries later. Imagine Sister Clare sneaking a verse into the margin, "My heart burns brighter than the candle flame." Was it divine longing, or something a little more earthly? Scholars still puzzle over such lines, tilting their heads and debating whether it's theology or flirtation. Historians still argue whether nunneries were simply passive producers of church-approved texts or hubs of subtle intellectual resistance. Did they just copy what they were told, or did they slip in coded critiques, secret affections, or even folk wisdom that the church wouldn't have sanctioned? A few manuscripts survive with odd doodles, faces, animals, or marginalia that seem suspiciously mischievous. You imagine yourself creeping into the scriptorium after dark. A single candle pulls light across a parchment sheet. Sister Agnes bends over the page, her quill dancing. She pauses, glances at the door, and then, with a furtive smile, begins a letter. Not to the abbess, not to a bishop, but perhaps to a cousin outside, or even to a forbidden friend. Her words, pressed into ink, will slip out of the convent tucked beneath bread in the delivery basket. The risk was immense. Letters could betray loyalties, expose hidden feelings, or simply remind a nun of the world she had supposedly renounced. If discovered, punishment could mean confinement, silence, or the burning of her work. And yet, human longing found its way into ink again and again. You can almost hear the scratching of quills around you. The sound is rhythmic, soothing, like rain on a roof. For some nuns, writing must have been a refuge, a place where thoughts could live beyond the silence of cloisters. For others, it was rebellion in miniature. After all, the pen is lighter than a sword, but it can cut just as sharply. And then there's humour too. Imagine Sister Margaret accidentally spilling ink across an entire page of prayers after hours of careful copying. Maybe she mutters something less than holy under her breath, then tries to cover the blot with an overly dramatic doodle of a fish. Somewhere in the margins of medieval manuscripts, mistakes like these survive, proof that even in sacred work, clumsiness had its moment. You run your hand along the edge of a shelf, your palm collecting dust. In your mind's eye, you see stacks of letters bundled with ribbons, hidden under floorboards, their secrets never delivered. Some might have carried only mundane news, crops, weather, the price of grain. Others might have held words too tender, too daring, to ever be read aloud in daylight. And as you leave the scriptorium, the candlelight seems to flicker more urgently, as though every flame were guarding not just scripture, but 100 unsent letters, each one a heartbeat pressed into parchment, still echoing centuries later. You drift now into the chapter house, where discipline was handed out like bitter medicine. This was the place where rules weren't just whispered, they were enforced. Imagine a semicircle of nuns seated on stone benches, habits rustling as the abbess enters, her face solemn, eyes scanning for cracks in obedience. A straightforward historical fact. Convents followed detailed codes of conduct, and breaking them meant punishment. The rule of St. Benedict, and later adapted codes, spelled out penalties for everything from talking at the wrong time to breaking fasting rules. These weren't minor slaps on the wrist. Some meant days of silence, exclusion from meals, or even corporal penance. And the quirky tidbit? Some punishments were oddly theatrical. A guilty sister might be required to eat her meals lying flat on the floor while the others sat upright at the table. Imagine the awkward shuffle of a nun trying to balance a spoonful of stew while sprawled on cold stone, the others pretending not to look. It's penitence, yes, but also unintentionally slapstick. Historians still argue whether convent punishments were harsher than those in monasteries. Some suggest that nuns, often younger and less willing recruits, pushed against rules more, leading to stricter discipline. Others argue that stories of brutal treatment were exaggerated later, used as propaganda against religious houses. The truth likely varied. Some abbesses ruled with severity, while others looked the other way when rules bent like old wood. You picture yourself sitting in that chapter house, your stomach knotting as a sister is called forward. Maybe she whispered in the garden when she wasn't supposed to. Maybe she skipped a midnight prayer, claiming she was ill when she was really just exhausted. The abbess asks for confession before the group, and the guilty nun kneels, head bowed, while the others murmur psalms. The air is heavy, but beneath it there's also the buzz of quiet judgment. Everyone knows that tomorrow it could be their turn. Sometimes punishment took the form of labor, extra hours scrubbing floors, kneeling in the chapel until knees ached, hauling buckets from the well until arms shook. And sometimes it was solitude. Imagine being locked in a small chamber for a day, the only light a sliver through a barred window. Solitude could feel holy at first. After hours, though, it stretched like a rope pulled too tight. Yet, as strict as the rules were, human nature found ways to soften them. There are tales of sisters deliberately breaking rules in minor ways, knowing the punishment would mean less work in the fields. Or of novices caught laughing during prayers, their giggles echoing like rebellious sparks against stone. Even discipline couldn't entirely erase the glimmers of mischief that flickered in cloistered hearts. You step toward the stone bench where the abbess might have sat. The seat feels colder than the others, as though centuries of authority pressed into the stone have left it permanently chilled. You imagine the abbess's gaze, sometimes stern, sometimes weary, maybe even sympathetic. After all, she too had once been a novice, trembling under that same gaze. And so punishment in convents wasn't just about correction. It was about control, about weaving fear and obedience into daily life. It was about making sure every nun remembered that her body and her voice weren't truly her own. They belonged to the community and, more importantly, to the church. But you sense something else lingering here too, because even in this room of rules and shame, secrets must have been exchanged. A comforting glance, a whispered reassurance, a hand brushing another's in passing. Punishment may have silenced voices, but it couldn't silence connection. You step away from the chill of the chapter house and into a small, vaulted chamber lined with reliquaries. The air here feels different, thicker, perfumed faintly with incense, as though smoke has soaked into the stones themselves. The flicker of candles reveals shelves crowded with objects both sacred and strange. Bone fragments wrapped in silk, vials filled with cloudy liquid, scraps of cloth pressed flat between panes of glass. A mainstream historical fact, relics were central to medieval spirituality. Convents collected them, displayed them, and used them to attract donations from pilgrims. A bone of a saint, a splinter of the true cross, even a vial of blood said to liquefy on holy days. These were prized beyond gold. The logic was simple. The holier the relics, the holier the house that guarded them. But then comes the quirky tidbit. Not all relics were convincing. There are records of convents proudly displaying feathers from the Holy Spirit's wing, or milk from the Virgin Mary, or thorns from the crown of Christ. Sometimes so many thorns that, as one critic joked, the world's forests could not account for them. You can imagine pilgrims kneeling earnestly before a glass vial, while Sister Margaret mutters under her breath, "That's goat's milk, but don't tell anyone." Historians still argue whether most people truly believed these objects were authentic, or whether belief itself mattered more than truth. Was it faith that transformed a bone fragment, perhaps from a cow, into something sacred? Or did the faithful simply suspend disbelief because the ritual, the spectacle, and the promise of miracles were too powerful to resist? You picture yourself in the reliquary chamber at midnight. The candlelight trembles on a gilded box said to hold a saint's finger. A nun kneels before it, whispering prayers, her shadow stretching long across the wall. Was she moved by holiness, or was she also aware that the box, studded with gems, doubled as a convenient treasury? Some relics were linked with miracles. Convents claimed cures for blindness, fertility, or plague through contact with their sacred objects. Pilgrims flocked to them, offering coins, livestock, or even land in gratitude. It was a holy business model, prayer in exchange for profit wrapped in devotion. And yet the darker side lingers. A reliquary could become a weapon of power. Imagine an abbess raising one during a dispute with a local lord, saying, "You wouldn't want to defy the saint who guards us." The shimmer of jewels and the weight of belief could silence arguments faster than any sword. There's humour here too. Picture a novice accidentally sneezing on a sacred handkerchief of Saint Veronica, only to be scolded for irreverence. Or imagine two convents squabbling over who had the real skull of Saint Catherine, awkward since both were proudly displaying it. Medieval Europe, it seems, was full of holy duplicates. You trace the outline of a reliquary with your eyes, a carved ivory box with silver hinges, glowing faintly in the candlelight. Whether its contents are authentic or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is the centuries of faith poured into it, the whispered prayers, the coins dropped into offering bowls, the sense of awe it inspired in those who knelt before it. And as you step back into the corridor, the incense still clinging to your clothes, you realize something important. Relics weren't just objects, they were mirrors. They reflected the hopes, fears, and faith of everyone who touched them, whether in truth, in fraud, or in a little of both. You leave the reliquary chamber and step into a space that smells of crushed herbs and damp linen. This is the infirmary, where sisters tended to the sick and the weary. The air is heavy with lavender, sage and vinegar, a makeshift pharmacy drawn from gardens and whispered recipes. Officially, nuns were caretakers of the body and soul, but in practice they became the community's midwives, healers, and sometimes miracle workers. A straightforward historical fact, nunneries often doubled as hospitals. They treated not only their own members, but also peasants, travellers, and the occasional noble who trusted cloistered women with remedies more than wandering physicians. Many nuns kept herbals, handwritten manuals listing treatments for fevers, wounds, childbirth, and even melancholy. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some nunneries were famous for rather unconventional cures. Records mention remedies like powdered toad, ashes of a burnt shoe, or a mixture of wine and ground pearls prescribed to ease labour pains. Imagine being handed that concoction, half cure, half dare, and politely pretending you felt better. Historians still argue whether convent medicine was based more on folk traditions or learned scholarship. Some manuscripts show advanced knowledge of plants, drawing from Greek and Arabic texts. Others read like superstition dressed up in Latin. Were these sisters genuine scientists in veils, or were they channeling ancient folk wisdom under a cloak of holiness? The debate continues. You picture yourself watching Sister Agnes grinding herbs in a mortar. The rhythmic thud echoes softly, blending with the wheeze of a patient nearby. She mixes honey with crushed garlic, spreading it on a wound. Another nun soaks cloths in vinegar to cool a fever. The work is tender, precise, and quietly heroic, even if the science behind it sometimes falters. But midwifery was the most guarded secret. Nuns were often called beyond convent walls to assist in births. Officially, their role was prayerful support, but in practice they had practical knowledge that rivaled lay midwives. You imagine a cloaked sister hurrying through darkened streets to a peasant's cottage, her hands steady, her presence both feared and revered. There's humour tucked in here too. Some remedies sound less like medicine and more like medieval stand-up comedy. For hiccups, hold your breath and recite a psalm backward. For toothache, kiss a mule on the nose. Imagine the poor novice assigned to hold the mule steady, but the seriousness lingers. Within convent walls, childbirth was a delicate subject. Officially, no nun should ever experience it. Yet hidden tragedies did occur. Secret pregnancies sometimes ended in births hushed up in the infirmary, the cries muffled behind barred doors. Such events rarely made it into records, but hints remain in scandalous rumours and disciplinary notes. You step closer to a shelf stacked with jars. Labels in Latin read Salvia, Mentha, Rosa. The scent is intoxicating, a mixture of garden and grave. You realize that these sisters weren't just healers of bodies. They were also keepers of knowledge, protectors of traditions that bridged medicine, magic, and faith. And as you leave the infirmary, the faint tang of rosemary clinging to your sleeve, you understand why people trusted nunneries. Behind their stone walls lay remedies for pain, prayers for the dying, and secrets that could never be written down without risking scandal or worse, accusations of sorcery. You step out of the infirmary and find yourself in a grand hall, unlike the others, higher ceilings, larger windows, and a seat of authority carved at the far end. This is the abbess's domain. If the convent were a kingdom, she was its queen. And in many ways, she wielded more power than the outside world ever admitted. A straightforward historical fact. Abbesses in medieval Europe often controlled vast estates. They managed land, collected rents, and acted as legal guardians for their communities. Some abbesses could even administer justice over tenants, rivaling local lords in influence. In certain regions, an abbess signed documents with the authority of a count or bishop. Imagine that, a woman, veiled and cloistered, yet commanding the respect of nobles. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some abbesses had their own seals, used to stamp official charters. These seals sometimes bore images not of saints, but of abbesses themselves, miniature portraits with stern faces and ornate robes. Picture Sister Margaret carefully pressing wax with a stamp that essentially says, "Yes, I'm the boss." Bureaucracy never looked so holy. Historians still argue whether abbesses genuinely wielded independent power or whether bishops always pulled the strings behind the curtain. Some records suggest abbesses resisted fiercely when bishops tried to claim revenues from their lands. Others hint that their authority was tolerated only as long as it served church hierarchy. The tension between freedom and oversight was constant. You imagine the abbess seated at the carved chair, her veil stiff, her ring gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Around her, sisters wait for instruction. Today she might order extra bread for the poor at the gate. Tomorrow she might negotiate a land dispute with a neighboring lord. The abbess was not just a spiritual mother, she was a politician, a diplomat, sometimes even a battlefield strategist. Though her weapons were words and influence rather than swords, power shaped her daily life differently than the other sisters. While novices scrubbed floors and chanted psalms, the abbess might entertain wealthy patrons in a private chamber, sipping spiced wine while discussing donations. That blend of holiness and hospitality made convent politics a delicate dance. And of course, there were scandals. Some abbesses were accused of favoritism, hoarding luxuries, or maintaining suspiciously close ties with powerful men. Whether true or not, these stories fed gossip. Picture the novices whispering behind her back as she walked past. "Did you see the new tapestry in her chambers? Must have cost a fortune." Medieval shade, delivered with a pious bow. Humour seeps in here too. Imagine the abbess trying to keep order while sisters argue over garden plots or whose turn it is to feed the cat. Even queens of cloisters dealt with the medieval equivalent of office drama. Yet beneath it all, the abbess's role carried immense weight. She held the convent's reputation in her hands. A wise abbess could protect her sisters, ensuring they lived in relative comfort and autonomy. A weak one could see the convent swallowed by greedy bishops or impoverished by poor management. You pause by her carved chair, running your fingers along the armrest. The wood is worn smooth, polished by centuries of hands gripping it during difficult decisions. You can almost hear the echoes of her voice, commanding, measured, sometimes weary. She was both shield and ruler, saint and strategist. And as you step back into the cloister, you realize the abbess wasn't just another nun. She was the beating heart of the convent, her secrets intertwined with its survival. You follow a narrow passage that twists beneath the convent, the air growing damp and cool. The walls close in, slick with condensation, and the flicker of your candle reveals stonework older than the cloister above. Stories whispered of tunnels, secret passages that connected nunneries to neighbouring estates, churches, or even the houses of local lords. A straightforward historical fact. Medieval convents were often built with cellars, crypts, and subterranean corridors, partly for storage and partly for protection during raids. In some cases, archaeological digs have uncovered walled-up doorways leading nowhere, or perhaps leading somewhere once, when discretion was more important than permanence. And the quirky tidbit, Local legends claimed that some convent tunnels allowed ghostly nuns to appear and vanish without warning. Villagers swore they saw veiled women gliding through fields at night, only to find no footprints in the morning. More practically, tunnels were sometimes rumoured to serve as escape routes or entry points for less than holy visitors. Historians still argue whether these tunnels were ever used for scandalous purposes or if they were mostly myth layered onto practical architecture. Were they genuinely secret? Or were they simply ordinary storerooms and drainage channels exaggerated by centuries of gossip? No one agrees, but the stories persisted, fed by human imagination and suspicion. You imagine yourself stepping carefully through the underground dark. The candle guttering in your hand throws shadows that leap like phantoms. Ahead, the passage branches, one side bricked off, the other continuing into gloom. You hear the drip of water, the scuttle of unseen creatures, and perhaps faintly the echo of footsteps that don't belong to you. What were these tunnels really used for? Smuggling food in times of famine? Hiding valuables during raids? Or, as rumour insisted, facilitating midnight rendezvous? One chronicle accuses an abbess of keeping a hidden passage so that favoured priests could visit unseen. Another suggests nuns used them to flee during outbreaks of plague. Truth and invention blur, as they so often do. There's humour here as well. Imagine a novice getting lost in a tunnel, stumbling back hours later covered in cobwebs, insisting she'd been chased by the devil, only to realise it was just the convent cat. Or picture a sister trying to smuggle bread through the dark, only to trip and scatter crumbs for generations of rats. Even secrecy can't always hide clumsiness. You reach a point where the tunnel slopes upward toward a faint draught. The air smells of earth and grass, a reminder that beyond these walls lay fields, villages, and the open sky. For cloistered women, such hidden paths might have felt like forbidden veins connecting them to freedom. Whether or not they were used for scandal, the possibility itself speaks volumes about longing. As you retrace your steps, the tunnel seems to close in again, the candle flame straining against the dark. And you realize sometimes the greatest secrets of medieval nunneries weren't what lay in plain sight, but what might have been hidden just beneath your feet. You emerge from the damp tunnel, back into the convent's main cloister, and the first sound that reaches you is not silence but music. The sisters' voices rise in unison, chanting the psalms, their harmonies weaving through the air like threads of light. By day, their songs echo like angelic choirs. But once night falls and the candles are snuffed, the same voices become whispers that carry very different messages. A straightforward historical fact: music was central to convent life. Nuns were expected to sing the divine office daily, and many convents became renowned for their choirs. Some abbesses even commissioned new compositions, turning their cloisters into hubs of sacred music. Manuscripts survive, with beautifully notated chants penned by women's hands, notes flowing across parchment like rivers of devotion. And the quirky tidbit, convent choirs sometimes became tourist attractions. Wealthy patrons and travellers came not only for relics but to hear the angelic singing of cloistered women. A few accounts even describe nuns performing polyphony so complex that visitors swore it was proof of divine inspiration. Imagine Sister Agnes secretly enjoying the applause behind the grille, though officially she sang only for God. Historians still argue whether these musical performances always remained purely devotional. Some evidence suggests that choirs competed with one another, vying for reputation and donations. Was it worship, or was it early concert culture wrapped in veils? The debate lingers like a note held just too long. By day, the chapel rang with orderly voices, each note in its place. By night, however, the corridors buzzed with whispers. You imagine yourself standing by a wooden door as sisters huddle inside, murmuring stories, confessions, or gossip. Perhaps they whispered about the abbess's new tapestry, or about a visiting priest whose glance lingered a little too long. Their laughter, quickly smothered, sounded almost like the trailing notes of a hymn. The contrast is striking. One moment, angelic voices lift prayers toward heaven. The next, hushed whispers tether secrets to the earth. Both belong here, both define the rhythm of convent life. You picture Sister Margaret, her voice soaring in perfect chant during Vespers, only to lean close to Sister Joan afterward and mutter, "Did you hear who sneaked bread from the kitchen?" The duality is almost comical. The same lips that shaped Kyrie Ellison also shaped rumours about onions, politics, or secret letters. Yet the whispers weren't always harmless. Rumours could wound reputations, erode trust, or even reach the ears of confessors who turned them into punishments. And sometimes the whispers carried weightier content, warnings of a pregnancy, suspicions of sorcery, or doubts about faith itself. To whisper such things was dangerous, but silence made the burden heavier still. You pause in the chapel now, your eyes following the curve of the vaulted ceiling as the last note of chant fades. The silence that follows feels almost louder than the song. Perhaps that was the point. The music wasn't meant only for beauty, but to heighten the silence that came after, to make you aware of what was missing. And as you step out again into the cloister, the day's songs echo in your ears, mingling with the imagined whispers of night. Together they form a kind of harmony, the official, the secret, the sung and the spoken, woven into one seamless soundscape that still clings to these walls. You walk now into a small library chamber, its shelves lined with dusty chronicles and faded letters. Here, tucked between records of land donations and saintly visions, lie stories of those who didn't stay. Not every nun endured cloistered life forever. Some slipped out through convent doors, leaving only rumours and scandal in their wake. A straightforward historical fact. Medieval records document wayward nuns, sisters who fled convents to pursue forbidden lives. Some left to marry, others to return to families, and a few simply vanished. Bishops and abbots issued stern letters demanding their return, branding them disobedient daughters of the church, yet many were never caught. And the quirky tidbit, one nun in 14th century France reportedly escaped disguised as a man, joining a troupe of travelling performers. She played instruments and sang in taverns until recognized years later. Imagine the shock, your cloister's missing sister suddenly strumming a lute in the marketplace, grinning wider than she ever did at Vespers. Historians still argue whether these accounts were exaggerated moral tales or genuine cases. Were the escaped nuns legendary cautionary examples, or were they real women whose courage unsettled chroniclers? Either way, the stories stuck, proof that the walls of a convent, though high, were not impenetrable. You picture yourself creeping to a gate at midnight, heart pounding, sandals muffled by straw. A novice might leave with only a cloak, a coin, and the taste of freedom sharp as frost. The risk was enormous. Capture could mean public shame, harsh penance, even imprisonment. But for some, the pull of the world outside, the promise of love, adventure, or simply choice was stronger than fear. Within convent walls, these stories became whispered legends. Younger novices listened wide-eyed as older sisters recounted tales of escapees, voices lowered as though the walls themselves might report them. Some whispered admiration, others condemnation. And perhaps more than one secretly wondered, could I do the same? There's humour here too. Imagine Sister Agnes planning her grand escape, only to be foiled when she tripped over the convent cat sprawled across the threshold. Or a novice slipping out with such drama, only to sneak back in the next morning because she'd forgotten how cold it was outside the cloister. Even rebellion sometimes wore clumsy shoes. Yet for those who succeeded, their absence haunted the convent. Every empty cell was a silent question mark. Did she find happiness? Did she regret it? Did she even survive? No one knew, and perhaps the uncertainty stung more than the betrayal itself. You run your hand across a cracked ledger, its ink faded, names scratched out, replaced by terse notes. She left, she did not return. The script is brisk, but the weight behind it lingers. Every vanished nun left more than an empty bed. she left a hole in the convent's carefully woven image of unity and obedience. And as you leave the library, you realize the most dangerous secret a convent could hold wasn't hidden treasure or whispered gossip. It was absence itself, the silent proof that even here, behind high walls, not every soul could be contained. You step into a narrow chamber lined with shelves of manuscripts, the scent of dried herbs mingling with ink. This was the convent's apothecary of the mind, recipe books, herbals, and curious notes passed down through generations. At first glance, the pages look like simple records of plants and prayers, but a closer look reveals something more daring, knowledge that blurred the boundary between holy healing and forbidden science. A straightforward historical fact: medieval convents preserved and copied medical texts from earlier traditions, Greek, Roman, and even Arabic sources. Some nuns became renowned for their expertise in herbal medicine, writing treatises that blended scripture with surprisingly practical remedies. They catalogued plants like sage for digestion, rosemary for memory, and willow bark for pain relief, the last one being a natural precursor to aspirin. And the quirky tidbit: some recipes are eyebrow-raising. One manuscript instructed that to cure baldness, a paste of burnt nettles, ash, and pigeon droppings should be applied to the scalp. Picture Sister Margaret patting a brother's shiny head with a bucket of pigeon paste, trying to keep a straight face. Holiness only stretches so far when you smell like a pigeon coop. Historians still argue whether convent medicine was merely tolerated folk wisdom or whether it edged toward forbidden experimentation. Some sisters recorded treatments that mirrored pagan traditions, invoking moon cycles or charms. Was this witchcraft, or simply practical survival knowledge wrapped in a veil of piety? The church was wary, but convents often operated far enough from scrutiny to keep such ambiguities alive. You imagine yourself seated at a table, watching a nun bend over her manuscript. She dips her quill, scratches lines of Latin, mixed with plant names in the local tongue. Beside her, jars of powdered roots, dried flowers, and oils clutter the desk. A candle burns low, wax dripping dangerously close to parchment. The scene is part pharmacy, part laboratory, part whispered rebellion. The blending of medicine and mysticism carried risks. A healer nun might be praised as a miracle worker when her remedies succeeded, but if they failed, or worse, if a patient died, she could face suspicion of sorcery. There are chronicles of sisters accused of dabbling in forbidden arts simply because they knew too much about herbs. Healing, in this fragile balance, could be both gift and curse. There's humour here too. One remedy for hiccups suggested drinking from a cup while being startled by a sudden shout. Imagine a novice sneaking up behind her sister with a loud boo while she sips water, both of them dissolving into suppressed giggles before the abbess storms in. Even medieval medicine couldn't resist a bit of slapstick. But beneath the jokes, there's reverence. These manuscripts weren't just about cures, they were about continuity. Knowledge preserved by women who might otherwise have been silenced. Recipes copied again and again, sometimes with little notes in the margins. This works well, or use less honey. A secret conversation spanning centuries passed hand to hand. You close one manuscript gently, the ink faded but still legible, and you realize convent science was never truly separate from faith or fear. It thrived in the grey space between, where healing blurred with heresy, and where the wisdom of women endured behind walls not built to contain it. You step into another chamber, darker than the rest. The walls are bare, the air heavy, and the faint smell of incense lingers, as though trying to mask something less holy. Here you find the stories of possession, exorcism, and the uneasy line between spiritual struggle and human conflict. A straightforward historical fact: convents were often sites of supposed demonic possession in the Middle Ages. Chronicles describe groups of nuns convulsing, speaking in strange voices or claiming to see visions of devils. Priests and bishops rushed in to perform exorcisms, and the events were recorded as both cautionary tales and proof of the devil's reach. And the quirky tidbit: in some cases, possessions seemed suspiciously political. One record tells of a nun who fell into convulsions every time her abbess entered the room, but miraculously calmed when the abbess left. Coincidence? or passive-aggressive protest in its most dramatic form. Imagine Sister Margaret rolling on the floor just to dodge extra chores, not very holy, but undeniably effective. Historians still argue whether these episodes were genuine psychological crises, mass hysteria, or convenient ways to express grievances in environments where open defiance wasn't possible. Was the devil really at work? Or were these women trapped in a cycle of repression, their bodies shouting what their voices could not? You picture yourself in the chapel at dawn, candles trembling as a young nun shrieks mid-prayer. Her sisters recoil, some crossing themselves, others watching with wide eyes. The abbess signals for the confessor, who strides in, holy water in hand, voice booming Latin phrases. The possessed nun writhes, her cries echoing against the vaulted ceiling. To the faithful it is a battle of heaven and hell. To you it looks just as much like a desperate cry for freedom. Exorcisms could be brutal, holy water splashed on bare skin, prayers shouted over sobs, relics pressed against trembling foreheads. Sometimes it ended with calm, sometimes with exhaustion, sometimes with a quiet burial when the devil refused to depart. And yet the spectacle also drew attention. Villagers gathered outside convent gates, whispering about demons within. Donations sometimes flowed in. Fear has always been a profitable business. Even abbesses recognized this, balancing the shame of scandal with the benefit of heightened fame. A haunted convent could be both a curse and a crowd puller. There's humor here, too, though grim. One chronicle mentions a nun who claimed to be tormented by demons that made her curse in French, though she only knew Latin. A skeptical priest muttered, "If devils are French, then I pity France." Medieval sass, alive and well in the middle of an exorcism. But behind the irony lies tragedy. For some sisters, possession was the only outlet. In a world where silence was demanded, where rebellion was punished, and where desire was condemned, convulsions and visions might have been the body's last language. You step away from the cold chapel stone and feel the weight of those voices echoing still. Maybe they were cries for help, maybe they were acts of resistance, maybe they were exactly what they seemed to their contemporaries, battles with forces unseen. And as you move on, you realize that in these nunneries, demons didn't always need horns or tails. Sometimes they wore veils. You climb a stairwell and step into a chamber where the air feels heavier, as if the walls themselves are stitched with history. Here lived the aristocrats in veils, the daughters of dukes, counts, and kings who traded silken gowns for habits, though often without surrendering all the privileges of their birth. A straightforward historical fact. Many convents relied on noble-born sisters and their dowries to sustain themselves. Some abbeys became almost aristocratic clubs, their halls filled with daughters of the elite. These women brought wealth, political connections, and often a sense of entitlement that shaped daily life in subtle but unmistakable ways. And here's the quirky tidbit. Dowries weren't always paid in gold or land. Some arrived in the form of livestock, jewelry, or even rare books. Imagine Sister Beatrice sweeping into the convent courtyard with a pair of peacocks as part of her offering. Holy or not, those birds definitely raised the prestige of the convent's garden. Historians still argue whether noble nuns truly blended into cloistered life, or whether their presence deepened divisions within convent walls. Did aristocrats in veils adapt to the same chores as peasant-born novices? Or did they preserve invisible hierarchies, quietly reminding everyone who their fathers were? Records hint at both realities, leaving the truth somewhere in the murk between prayer and pride. You picture a noble-born sister walking the cloister with her veil perfectly pressed, her ring finger glittering faintly with a jewel she wasn't supposed to keep. She sings in the choir, yes, but her voice carries the training of tutors hired at her family's expense. While Sister Margaret scrubs floors until her knuckles crack, this aristocratic nun may be illuminating manuscripts, sipping a little imported wine in the abbess's chamber, or negotiating land disputes through letters written in elegant Latin. The divide was sharpest during meals. While the rule demanded equality, some convents allowed noble-born nuns extra allowances, better wine, softer bread, even separate seating. Picture the awkward silence as half the table gnawed coarse rye, while the other half nibbled almond cakes. Not exactly the spirit of poverty and humility. There's humour in it too. Imagine a young baron's daughter trying to milk a convent goat for the first time, shrieking when it kicked the bucket over. Or a noble novice refusing to chop onions, insisting her fingers were too delicate. Medieval class drama played out in kitchens instead of castles. And yet these aristocratic women also wielded power. Their dowries kept convents afloat, their connections protected abbeys from local lords, and their presence raised the convent's prestige. A noble nun might correspond with her family at court, ensuring political favours or donations. Some abbesses even came from these families, ruling their convents with the same confidence their brothers carried on to battlefields. You pause by a carved bench where such women may have sat, their posture impeccable, their eyes scanning novices with a cool authority. Behind the veil, they were both equal sisters and untouchable elites. And as you step out of that chamber, you realize aristocrats in veils weren't simply daughters hidden away. They were bridges between cloisters and courts, carrying worldly power into spaces meant to renounce the world, making the convent not only a house of prayer, but also a quiet stage for politics in silk and shadow. You move toward the convent's outer wall, where ivy creeps over weathered stone, and here the air feels heavier, with secrets not spoken in chants, because behind the facade of holiness lay stories of intimacy that crossed the most forbidden line, love affairs between nuns and priests. A straightforward historical fact, numerous church records and court cases from the Middle Ages mention scandals between clergy and women in convents. Confessors, chaplains, or visiting monks often had regular access to nuns, and the boundaries of spiritual guidance sometimes blurred into something far less sanctioned. These affairs were condemned harshly by bishops, yet the frequency of recorded cases suggests they were not isolated accidents. And here's the quirky tidbit. One 14th-century bishop complained in a letter that a local priest kept visiting the convent orchard at suspicious hours. His solution? He ordered the convent to build a higher wall around the garden. As if stone could keep temptation out, or keep it in. Historians still argue whether these tales were overblown by critics of the church, exaggerated to shame rivals, or whether they reflected a widespread reality. Were the convents truly dens of secret romance, or were a handful of cases magnified into legend? The debate continues, with truth likely tangled in rumour and scandal alike. You picture yourself standing in that orchard at dusk, the last light glimmering on apple blossoms. A priest's voice drifts low through the hedges, a nun's reply softer still. Maybe it was a confession that shifted too close. Maybe it was loneliness finding an echo. Either way, the orchard became more than soil and trees. It became a stage for risk. The punishments were severe. Priests caught in such liaisons faced suspension or exile. Nuns were shamed, sometimes imprisoned within their convent, sometimes moved to harsher houses. And yet, the stories kept surfacing. Desire, it seems, was harder to police than prayer. There's humour here too, if darkly so. Imagine the poor novice ordered to chaperone the abbess's meetings, awkwardly trailing behind like a medieval third wheel, pretending not to notice the stolen glances. Or picture Sister Margaret sighing, "At least the priest brings decent wine." Scandal always seems to come with a side of absurdity. And yet, behind the laughter lurks tragedy. For many of these women, intimacy was not just rebellion, it was perhaps the only taste of tenderness in lives bound by silence and stone. The risk of discovery loomed over every glance, every letter, every whispered word. You pause by the convent wall, running your hand across its rough surface. Was it built to keep the world out, or to keep longing in? Either way, cracks in the stone and in the rules made room for human weakness to slip through. And as you step back into the cloister, you realize the stories of priests and nuns weren't only about sin. They were about the impossibility of confining the heart, even when the church itself built walls around it. You turn down a narrow hall where the air feels colder, the stones darker, as though the very walls absorbed centuries of sorrow. Because for some women, the convent was not a sanctuary at all, it was a prison. Families sent them here not out of piety, but out of shame, punishment, or convenience. A straightforward historical fact: in medieval Europe, unwanted daughters, widows, and even wives accused of scandal were sometimes locked away in nunneries against their will. The Church endorsed cloisters as houses of repentance, but in reality, they were often dumping grounds for women who had embarrassed their families or threatened their inheritance plans. Here's the quirky tidbit. Legal records show that some women fought their confinement fiercely. One 14th century case describes a noblewoman pounding on convent gates so loudly that villagers gathered outside, only for guards to drag her back inside. Imagine that scene, half tragedy, half farce, as townsfolk debated whether she was a lost soul or simply someone who wanted her freedom back. Historians still argue whether these women eventually accepted cloister life or if they remained resentful until their deaths. Some chronicles portray them as pious converts discovering holiness after initial resistance. Others suggest their vows were hollow, obedience performed only under duress. The truth is hard to pin down, hidden between lines of carefully written monastic records. You picture yourself as one of those women. Perhaps you'd been accused of impropriety, or perhaps you were simply a younger daughter whose dowry your father refused to pay. Suddenly you find yourself locked behind these walls, your veil forced onto your head, your name struck from family records. You walk the cloister, your footsteps echoing not with prayer, but with bitterness. Some prisoners adapted. They threw themselves into prayer, work, or silence. Others resisted quietly, refusing to sing in choir, breaking fasting rules, or sneaking messages through sympathetic servants. And some resisted loudly, their cries shaking the chapel until the abbess ordered stricter punishment. There's humour hidden even here. Imagine Sister Margaret grumbling so theatrically during prayers that novices stifled giggles, or a prisoner cleverly bribing the convent cook to slip her extra wine. Even in captivity, the human spirit found ways to poke holes in despair. Yet the weight of it lingers. Imagine kneeling in chapel, surrounded by women who chose this life, while you stare at the crucifix and whisper, "I never wanted this." The chants rise around you, but your heart beats louder with longing for fields, families, or freedom denied. You pause by a barred window, its iron cold against your hand. Outside lies the village, where people laugh, work, and live. Inside, the cloister swallows your voice. Was this really salvation, or just another kind of exile? And as you step away, the shadows stretch longer, and you understand the convent was never one single story. For some, it was holy refuge. For others, it was punishment carved in stone. You step into the infirmary again, but this time you notice how its shadows seem thicker, its silence more unsettling. Because not all healing here was about herbs and prayers. Some secrets were buried deeper, stories of pregnancies carried behind cloister walls, and births that the chronicles rarely admitted. A straightforward historical fact. Although nuns were bound by vows of chastity, there are scattered records of convent scandals involving pregnancies. When discovered, these cases were treated as major transgressions, leading to punishments ranging from lifelong confinement to the dissolution of entire convents. Bishops used such events as proof that strict oversight was necessary. And the quirky tidbit, one 14th century visitation report mentions a nun who gave birth in secret, the child smuggled away under the pretense of being an orphan taken in for charity. The bishop's note ends dryly. The matter has been resolved, which sounds suspiciously like medieval shorthand for "let's never speak of this again." Historians still argue whether such cases were frequent or rare. Were convents truly riddled with hidden pregnancies, or were these isolated scandals inflated by critics of the Church? Records are vague, often written to protect reputations. But even a few cases whispered across villages could stain an abbey's image for generations. You imagine the scene. A young nun, her veil pulled low, clutching her belly beneath her habit. Whispers follow her down the corridor, though no one dares speak openly. In the dead of night, she is led to the infirmary, where candles burn low and linens are laid out. Sisters gather, faces tight with fear. The cries are muffled behind barred shutters. And by dawn, a baby's wail may or may not echo through the cloister halls. What happens next? Sometimes the child was given to a foundling hospital, sometimes it was claimed as a relative's orphan, and sometimes darker solutions were rumoured, though rarely written down. Silence was survival, and silence erased. There's uneasy humour too. Imagine the visiting bishop arriving months later, peering around suspiciously, while the sisters scramble to hide a chubby-cheeked orphan in the laundry. Or picture the convent cat suddenly earning extra devotion as everyone pretends its meows were the sounds villagers swore they'd heard at night. But beneath the nervous laughter lies the tragedy of it. For many of these women, such secrets weren't products of choice. Some affairs were genuine, but others may have been coerced, confessors or patrons abusing access and authority. A nun's pregnancy could signal love, weakness, or violation, and the truth was often locked away tighter than the convent gates. You pause in the infirmary, staring at the wooden cot pushed into a corner. The linens are rough, the mattress thin, but once upon a time it might have been the stage of a secret birth. The echoes of those muffled cries may still linger, unheard by the world outside. And as you step into the corridor once more, you realize the greatest secrets of nunneries weren't jewels or whispers of tunnels. They were lives, tiny lives that began in shadow, erased before they could ever see daylight, but never fully forgotten by the walls that hid them. You step back into the cloister and let your eyes follow the lines of stone, the way the architecture itself seems designed to hold things in place, not only people, but also secrets. Every arch, every window, every wall had a purpose, and that purpose was control. The convent wasn't just a building, it was a cage dressed in holiness. A straightforward historical fact: convents were built with deliberate architectural features to enforce seclusion. High walls surrounded the grounds, windows were often barred or fitted with wooden grills, so the sisters could see out without being seen. Doors had double locks, some convents even had turning wheels, wooden drums built into walls that allowed goods to pass in and out without the nuns ever touching the outside world. And here's the quirky tidbit: those turning wheels didn't just carry bread or alms. In some convents, villagers used them to drop off abandoned infants, knowing the sisters would raise the children or send them to foundling hospitals. Imagine Sister Margaret spinning the wheel expecting a loaf of bread and being startled by a squirming bundle of baby instead. Holy surprises come in all sizes. Historians still argue whether architecture truly protected nuns or whether it was primarily about preserving appearances. Did the high walls shield women from danger, or did they simply ensure their obedience by cutting them off from escape? Some records suggest nuns still found ways to signal through windows or slip letters over walls. Architecture, after all, is only as strong as human determination is weak. You picture yourself walking the inner courtyard, the sky framed like a square of freedom above. The cloister arcade is elegant, its stone carved with vines and flowers. Beautiful, yes, but also suffocating, because beauty doesn't change the fact that the world beyond those walls is off limits. Even the chapel reinforced separation. In many convents, the choir was built behind a screen or grille, so that townsfolk attending Mass could hear the sisters sing but never see their faces. Voices floated out like angels, but the women remained invisible, their humanity erased by bars and shadows. And yet, the walls couldn't stop longing. You imagine a nun standing by a barred window at dusk, her fingers wrapped around cold iron, watching villagers walk home from market. She sees children laughing, hears the faint clang of blacksmiths, smells smoke from kitchen fires. All things she cannot touch, but all things she cannot forget. There's humour here too. Some convent windows were so heavily barred that sisters joked they lived in gilded cages. Picture novices tossing crumbs to pigeons through the lattice, muttering that the birds had more freedom than they did. Not exactly the sort of hymn the abbess wanted sung. You run your hand along the cloister wall, feeling the rough stone under your palm. It's strong, unyielding, but not silent. It hums with the memory of centuries, prayers, cries, laughter, secrets all pressed into its mortar. Architecture here wasn't just shelter. It was a language of control written in stone, speaking louder than any sermon, and as you move away, you realize the convent's greatest secret wasn't what happened inside. It was how carefully its very walls were built to ensure that what happened inside never slipped out. You leave the heavy walls behind and step into a chamber brightened by a slant of afternoon light. Here, the air hums differently, less about silence, more about creation. This is the workshop where sisters painted, gilded, and bound manuscripts. Their hands, steady and stained with ink, left behind some of the most exquisite art of the Middle Ages. But sometimes, in the curling vines and delicate borders, secrets were hidden in plain sight. A straightforward historical fact: many convents trained nuns as scribes and illuminators. They copied psalters, hymnals, and prayer books, often for wealthy patrons who paid handsomely for the work. Some manuscripts from convents are among the finest examples of medieval art, complete with gilded initials and tiny, intricate miniatures. And the quirky tidbit: not all the doodles were holy. In the margins of certain manuscripts, nuns sketched rabbits jousting on snails, monkeys playing bagpipes, or little caricatures of grumpy abbesses. Imagine Sister Margaret, quill poised, suppressing a giggle as she drew a cat in a nun's wimple chasing mice across the border of a psalm. Sacred text in the middle, medieval cartoon strip at the edges. Historians still argue whether some marginalia carried hidden meanings, coded messages, satire, or even traces of personal longing. Did a cluster of intertwined vines hint at forbidden affection? Did the faint initials tucked in a corner stand for more than in nomine domini? Scholars lean over magnifying glasses, still debating whether some of these marks were devotional flourishes or sly acts of rebellion. You picture yourself standing at a long wooden table. Sister Agnes bends over a sheet of vellum, carefully applying gold leaf with a breath soft enough to make it shimmer. To your left, another sister grinds pigments, lapis lazuli into brilliant blue, saffron into yellow, soot into black. The room smells of glue, parchment, and crushed stone, a sacred alchemy of art. But as the pages turn, so too do the secrets. Perhaps in one illuminated capital letter, the face of a saint looks suspiciously like a local noble who donated generously, or perhaps a page shows a flower not common to the region, hinting at a memory carried from outside. Little windows into lives that weren't supposed to exist beyond prayer. Humour slips in here as well. Imagine a novice ruining weeks of work by sneezing on wet ink, leaving a blotch that had to be turned into an awkwardly oversized decorative flourish, or an illuminator slipping in a tiny snail on every page just to annoy her sisters, sparking whispered debates about whether snails were some deep theological symbol or just an inside joke. And yet the artistry had power. These manuscripts travelled. A prayer book made by cloistered hands might end up in the chapel of a king. A psalter might survive centuries, its gilded borders glowing in a museum today. Through ink and paint, nuns spoke across time, leaving messages far louder than any chant lost in cloister walls. You trace your gaze across the imagined pages, and the glint of gold seems to follow you. You realize art in convents wasn't only about devotion, it was also about presence, permanence, and sometimes defiance. And though voices were silenced behind grills, their hands still shouted in colour, leaving marks that neither abbess nor bishop could erase. You step away from the glowing manuscripts and into a smaller chamber that smells of smoke and dried herbs. Here, the atmosphere shifts. Less sacred artistry, more suspicion. Because within these walls, healing and science often brushed against something darker, the fear of witchcraft. A straightforward historical fact. Many nuns practiced medicine through herbs, poultices, and charms. Their knowledge of plants was vast, inherited from generations of folk tradition as well as written herbals. But as the late Middle Ages moved into the era of witch hunts, this same knowledge became dangerous. A woman who cured fevers with sage was a healer one day and a suspected witch the next. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some convents, sisters openly used charms that today would make you raise an eyebrow. One recipe advised writing the word abracadabra in a triangle on parchment and hanging it around the patient's neck to cure fevers. Imagine Sister Margaret solemnly handing over an abracadabra amulet while pretending it was as respectable as garlic soup. Historians still argue whether nuns truly faced witchcraft accusations within convents or whether these fears were projected onto them later. Some sources suggest that abbesses defended their sisters fiercely, framing remedies as holy knowledge. Others hint that rival factions within convents sometimes weaponized accusations, whispering that a sister's visions or cures were unnatural. You picture yourself in the herb garden at dusk. The air smells of thyme and rue. A sister bends to pluck mandrake roots, their twisted shapes resembling tiny human figures. Villagers watching from beyond the wall might mutter about sorcery. Inside the convent, the root will be dried, ground, and stirred into a potion meant to ease pain. But perception is everything, and perception could kill. There's humour here too, though sharp-edged. Imagine the novice who mislabels a jar of powdered nettles as cinnamon, accidentally baking the world's spiciest loaf of bread. Or the sister who insists her hiccup cure involves singing 3 psalms backward while hopping on one foot. Even suspicion can't stop remedies from slipping into absurdity. But beneath the laughter, the fear is real. A sister with too much knowledge might draw suspicion not only from villagers, but from priests who mistrusted female authority. Healing, when practiced too confidently, blurred into heresy. And visions, whether from divine inspiration or from herbal concoctions, could be used as evidence of possession. You pause by a small shelf of jars. Their labels, faded and curling, read Salvia, Mentha, Rosa, just as they did in the infirmary. Yet in this chamber they feel less like cures and more like evidence waiting to be twisted. The same rosemary that flavoured convent stews could be rebranded as a witch's charm under the wrong circumstances, and as you step back into the cloister you realise the line between nun and witch was thinner than you think. One prayer, one herb, one whispered rumour was all it took for holiness to turn into heresy. You wander toward the convent gate where pilgrims once gathered in long lines, clutching candles, coins, and hopes they barely dared to name. For nunneries weren't only closed sanctuaries, they were also places of business, quietly humming with the traffic of politics and profit. A straightforward historical fact: many convents owned relics or shrines that drew pilgrims, and with pilgrims came donations. Some abbeys grew wealthy from the steady stream of offerings, money, livestock, or even land deeds given in exchange for prayers or miracles. The nuns, cloistered behind walls, became invisible hostesses of a holy economy. Here's the quirky tidbit. Records show that some convents charged pilgrims not just for access to relics, but for souvenirs, wax figurines, blessed tokens, or even pieces of cloth said to have touched a saint's bones. Imagine Sister Margaret sighing as she moulds her 50th little wax lamb of the week, muttering, "All this, and I still don't get extra dessert." Historians still argue whether these pilgrim industries were exploitative or genuinely acts of devotion. Did people give out of faith, or were they coerced by subtle pressures and promises? Some suggest convents exaggerated miracles to boost traffic. Others argue that the exchange of faith and coin was simply how medieval religion functioned, no more cynical than any tithe. You picture yourself standing outside the gate as pilgrims shuffle forward. A woman clutches a child with a fever, whispering prayers as she offers her last silver coin. A farmer bows low, leaving a sack of grain in hopes of better harvests. A merchant kneels stiffly, calculating in his head the value of the land he has just promised for perpetual prayers. Inside, the abbess and her council count the offerings. Some go to feed the poor, as promised. Others line the storerooms with spices, cloth, and wine. The line between charity and profit blurs as neatly as ink on parchment. There's humour here too. Imagine a group of pilgrims arguing in the courtyard over whose relic was more effective, the convent's miracle fingerbone or the abbey down the road's miracle toenail. Medieval Yelp reviews delivered with side-eye and psalms, but profit had consequences. Pilgrim traffic made convents political players, towns vied for holy sites to boost trade, and abbesses guarded their relics fiercely, sometimes even clashing with bishops who wanted control of the revenue. Holiness, once again, became currency. You glance at the worn threshold by the gate. Thousands of feet passed here, carrying desperation, gratitude, or simple curiosity. Each pilgrim left a little wealth, a little story, and perhaps a little doubt. Did the relic really heal? Did the prayers truly work? Or was faith itself the only miracle? And as you turn back into the cloister, the echoes of those footsteps seem to linger, reminding you that behind every whispered prayer at the gate, there was always the quiet clink of a coin. You follow the sound of voices into the cloister's grand hall, where the floor gleams from careful scrubbing and fresh rushes are scattered to mask the smell of damp stone. The sisters sit straighter than usual, their habits freshly laundered, their eyes darting nervously toward the entrance. Something important is about to happen. The convent is preparing for a royal visit. A straightforward historical fact. Kings, queens, and high-ranking nobles occasionally visited nunneries, whether to inspect, donate, or simply show piety. These visits were opportunities for abbesses to secure patronage and for rulers to remind everyone who held ultimate authority. Convents staged themselves carefully, every sister in place, every chant rehearsed. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some convents reportedly borrowed luxuries from local patrons just to impress visiting royalty. Furniture, silverware, even fine tapestries were carried in for the occasion, only to be whisked away afterward. Imagine Sister Margaret anxiously polishing a borrowed goblet while whispering, don't drop it, or we'll all be praying for a miracle of repair." Historians still argue whether these royal inspections were genuine acts of devotion or thinly veiled audits of power and property. Did rulers come to admire holy life, or to ensure convent wealth was properly aligned with their interests? The truth probably leaned toward both, as piety and politics rarely walked separately in the Middle Ages. You picture yourself standing by the chapel door as the hall fills with incense. The nuns file into choir stalls, their chants echoing with precision, every note rehearsed like soldiers drilling for parade. The abbess greets the royal guest with a bow so deep her veil brushes the floor. Behind her, the sisters lower their eyes, though you can feel the nervous energy buzzing through them. The visit is a performance. The cloister looks orderly. The sisters appear serene. The relics gleam as if freshly polished. But behind the curtain, you know things are not always so pristine. The kitchen hides signs of meagre meals. The dormitory reeks of sweat and straw. And the novices whisper about how long the borrowed silver must be returned. There's humour, too. Imagine a novice fainting mid-chant from nerves, or a cat leaping onto the altar just as the Queen enters. History doesn't record these slip-ups, but you know they must have happened. Little cracks in the solemn mask of staged sanctity. The stakes were high. A successful visit could mean new donations, protection, or even land grants. A poorly executed one could bring suspicion, audits, or stricter oversight from bishops emboldened by royal interest. For the abbess, it was like walking a tightrope over open flame. You glance at the doorway, where muddy boot prints mark the stone, evidence of visitors who don't belong to this cloistered rhythm. Their presence disrupts the silence, but it also reminds you how entangled the convent truly is with the world beyond its walls. And as the royal entourage departs, leaving behind coins, gifts, and a sigh of relief from the sisters, you realize sanctity in a convent was often as much about appearances as it was about devotion. Sometimes holiness had to be rehearsed. You step into the cloister courtyard, and suddenly the world feels rawer, harsher. Because no matter how thick the walls, no convent was safe from the disasters that swept across the Middle Ages. fires, plagues, and famine. When calamity struck, the quiet rhythms of prayer shattered, and survival itself became the only liturgy. A straightforward historical fact: fires were a constant threat in medieval convents. Candles and oil lamps flickered day and night. Parchment and wooden beams turned buildings into tinderboxes. Whole cloisters burned to the ground more than once. Rebuilding was slow, often dependent on the mercy of donors. And here's the quirky tidbit. One chronicle describes a convent fire supposedly caused by a nun who fell asleep while warming her feet by a candle. Her sandals caught, then her habit, and within moments flames tore through the dormitory. Imagine the abbess's face as she scolded, "This is why we don't toast our toes indoors." A tragic accident, remembered forever in nervous jokes. Historians still argue whether plagues hit convents harder than towns. Some suggest cloisters, being enclosed, offered protection. Others note that once disease entered, it spread rapidly among women sharing dormitories and refectories. Mortality rates soared. In some places, convents were left nearly empty, their bells tolling for sisters who had no replacements. You imagine the courtyard during a plague year. The garden lies untended, weeds pushing through paths. The air smells of vinegar and smoke, crude attempts at fumigation. Candles burn in the chapel for the dead, their wax dripping faster than prayers can keep pace. A novice coughs in the corner, her face pale, while older sisters murmur psalms with voices raw from grief. And then there was famine. Convents depended on harvests from their lands and tithes from peasants. In bad years, fields failed, granaries emptied, convent kitchens served nothing but thin broth. Some sisters wasted away in silence, while others defied rules to sneak scraps to the poor at the gate, even when food was scarce for themselves. Yet humour crept even into hardship. Chronicles tell of sisters joking that fasting was easy when there's nothing to eat anyway. Imagine a grim chuckle passing along the refectory table as they spoon up broth so watery you could see your reflection in it. But behind the jokes lay resilience. When fire struck, nuns rebuilt with charred hands. When plagues swept through, survivors cared for the sick with trembling faith. When famine tightened its grip, they shared what little they had, sometimes surviving only because nearby villages gave back to the convent that had once healed them. You stand in the courtyard, looking at the sky, which glows faintly red as if lit by invisible embers. You can almost hear the tolling of a plague bell, the crackle of fire, the groan of empty stomachs. These disasters weren't just interruptions, they became part of cloister memory, etched into stone and story alike. And as you leave the courtyard, you realize the secrets of nunneries weren't only whispered in shadows. Sometimes they were screamed by disaster, by smoke, by silence left behind when too many voices were gone. You return indoors, the courtyard's ghosts still clinging to your clothes, and find yourself seated in a chapter room where parchment documents litter the table. The air is thick, not with incense this time, but with tension, because reform has come knocking at the convent door, and not everyone is ready to open it. A straightforward historical fact. Beginning in the late Middle Ages, especially by the 15th and 16th centuries, reform movements swept across Europe. Church authorities pushed to tighten discipline in monasteries and nunneries, cracking down on what they saw as lax practices, luxury, or scandal. Visitations by bishops became frequent, their reports bristling with complaints about decay of morals. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some reforming bishops were so exasperated that they issued oddly specific rules. One German bishop forbade nuns from keeping pet songbirds because the music was deemed too frivolous. Imagine Sister Margaret reluctantly releasing her beloved canary, muttering that holiness would be quieter, but definitely more boring. Historians still argue whether these reforms truly improved spiritual discipline, or whether they simply crushed what little freedom and individuality convent women had carved out for themselves. Some argue reforms saved nunneries from corruption. Others suggest it strangled them, turning once vibrant communities into rigid cages. You picture the meeting. The abbess sits at the head of the table, a bishop's letter spread before her. Its Latin phrases drip with authority: stricter fasting, harsher silence, stricter enclosure. Around her, sisters murmur uneasily. Some nod, ready to obey. Others glance at each other with sparks of defiance in their eyes. Reform wasn't always met with quiet acceptance. Some nunneries resisted fiercely, refusing to give up their customs. There are cases of nuns barring convent gates against bishops, shouting down orders, or appealing directly to noble patrons for protection. Imagine the cloister courtyard filled with women chanting psalms not in piety but in protest, and humour lingers even here. Picture the sisters defiantly sneaking a forbidden feast of cheese and wine the night after the bishop leaves, raising cups in mock salute. To reform! The best rebellion, after all, sometimes came in the form of a very unholy midnight snack. But beneath the laughter, the stakes were real. For some, reform meant losing little joys, the songbird, the extra blanket, the whispered conversation in the garden. For others, it meant true hardship, harsher punishments, more rigid walls, less contact with the outside world. The reformers called it purity. The sisters may have called it suffocation. You glance at one of the parchments left on the table, the ink still sharp. Decreto ad strict observandum, a decree to be strictly observed. You trace the letters and you feel the weight of rules pressing down across centuries. And as you leave the chapter room, you realize rebellion didn't always roar in nunneries. Sometimes it whispered, resisted quietly in gardens, in kitchens, in marginal doodles on manuscripts, and sometimes it sang louder than any reform decree could silence. You step into a long gallery where the plaster crumbles and the beams sag. The air is colder here, touched by neglect, because this is the part of the story where the walls begin to falter, and the nunneries that once held such power and secrecy slip slowly into decline. A straightforward historical fact: by the late Middle Ages and into the Reformation, many nunneries across Europe began to dwindle. Some were dissolved outright by reformers like Henry VIII in England. Others simply withered as fewer women took vows, dowries dried up, or scandals eroded reputations. What had once been vibrant centres of prayer and wealth became ghostly shells. And the quirky tidbit: some abandoned convent buildings were later converted into breweries, barns, or even private homes. One former English nunnery was turned into a sheepfold, its chapel ringing not with chants, but with bleating. Picture Sister Margaret returning as a ghost, muttering, "All these centuries of psalms, and now it smells like mutton." Historians still argue whether this decline was inevitable or preventable. Was it the natural result of changing social and economic structures, or was it triggered mostly by outside interference from reformers and monarchs? Some claim nunneries collapsed under their own contradictions. Others say they were crushed deliberately to strip women of independent power. You picture the decay setting in, the garden grows wild, herbs tangling into weeds. The library gathers dust, books left half-finished as scribes abandon their desks. Windows crack, shutters hang loose, rain drips through the rafters. In the chapel, fewer voices rise to sing, and the silence afterward feels hollow rather than holy. The sisters who remained often aged together, their numbers dwindling without new novices to replace them. Imagine a handful of elderly women shuffling through the cloister, habits patched and faded, memories of former grandeur lingering in their voices. They speak of when the choir was full, when pilgrims crowded the gates, when abbesses corresponded with kings. Now the halls echo with absence. There's humour here too, though tinged with sadness. Chronicles mention nuns renting out spare rooms to travellers in their decline, essentially running holy bed and breakfasts. Picture an abbess awkwardly welcoming a merchant. Yes, breakfast is bread and cabbage soup. And no, we don't offer refunds. Holiness had to make ends meet somehow, but the decline also revealed resilience. Even as wealth faded, some sisters clung fiercely to their vows. They prayed in empty chapels, tended shrinking gardens, and kept faith alive in silence. Their devotion might not have drawn crowds, but it endured quietly, like embers glowing long after firewood burns away. You pause in the gallery, your footsteps stirring dust. The walls feel tired, their secrets sagging under centuries of weight, yet in the cracks and ruins, something remains, the persistence of voices that refused to vanish completely. And as you step back into the cloister one last time, you realize the dark secrets of nunneries didn't just end with scandal, they ended with silence and absence that spoke just as loudly as any whispered sin. You return to the cloister one final time, where the light is dim, the candles nearly spent. The stones hum faintly under your feet, as if they're exhaling centuries of secrets at once. You've wandered through whispers of forbidden letters, clandestine tunnels, midnight births, gilded manuscripts, and punishments too quiet to echo beyond these walls. Now the story winds down like smoke curling from an extinguished flame. A straightforward historical fact. By the early modern period, many medieval nunneries disappeared entirely. Some were demolished, others repurposed, and only a few survived into modern times, transformed into schools or parish houses. The lives of the women within, complex, flawed, and hidden, were often reduced in chronicles to piety or scandal, rarely the full truth. And the quirky tidbit, in some convent ruins, archaeologists have found odd traces. Child-sized skeletons in cloister grounds, scraps of jewellery hidden beneath floorboards, even graffiti etched into stone. One wall bears the faint outline of a heart carved next to initials, as if some anonymous sister couldn't resist leaving behind her secret love in code. Even in ruins, humanity refuses to be erased. Historians still argue whether the legacy of nunneries should be seen as triumphs of female community or cautionary tales of oppression. Were they prisons or sanctuaries? Were they places of empowerment or silence? The answer, like everything else here, lies in shadow. You picture the cloister, now empty, the doors barred, the windows cracked. The choir stalls stand abandoned, dust collecting where once voices soared. The herb garden lies wild, thyme and rosemary spilling into weeds. The reliquary glitters faintly in the dark, no pilgrims left to kneel before it. The silence here isn't chosen anymore, it's simply the silence of absence. And yet the whispers remain. If you lean against the stone, you might still hear faint laughter from novices, the scrape of quills, the distant toll of bells, perhaps even the muffled cries of a hidden birth or the sharp hiss of a secret reprimand. The walls have kept it all like parchment layered with too much ink. There's one last flicker of humour, too. Imagine a ghostly abbess scolding phantom sisters for tracking dust across the cloister centuries after the last broom fell silent. Some habits, it seems, die harder than others. Now, as you stand in the corridor with shadows curling around you, the candles sputter out one by one. Darkness softens everything, wrapping stone, memory, and secret into the same quiet blanket. And you know, the dark secrets of medieval nunneries don't really end. They linger, half-hidden, in ruins, in chronicles, and now in your own imagination. And so let's wind down together. Let the pace soften like footsteps slowing after a long journey. Picture the cloister fading behind you, its arches dissolving into twilight. The whispers that once pressed against your ears now drift farther, gentler, like the echo of a lullaby you can barely remember. The walls crumble, the gates swing open, and even the secrets loosen their grip. What once felt heavy is now distant, almost tender, as if the centuries themselves have decided to let it all rest. Your breathing steadies. The night air is cool, brushing your skin with a calm so different from the cloister's stifling silence. The bells that once rang so insistently are gone now, replaced by the rhythm of your own pulse, slow and even. Imagine lying down, the stone beneath you softening into earth, the earth into a bed, the bed into a cloud. Candles wink out one by one until only the stars remain, scattered above like tiny reliquaries of light. Let the last echoes fade. The sisters are gone, their secrets folded into dust, their songs dissolved into air. All that remains is stillness, and the slow drift of your mind into rest, sweet dreams.